Welcome back to Bandit Time. I am the Bandit. Let's get right to the show. It's week 1 and people are overreacting. That's okay. Don't get carried away though. I just want to focus on the Detroit Lions and their next 6 weeks or their next 5 weeks after their victory over the Kansas City Chiefs on Thursday Night Football. So, from a fantasy football perspective, the first 6 weeks of the season are very important. It's about half of the fantasy regular season. And you're really gonna, see people in your leagues start to overreact to week 1, 2, 3 as they start out 0-1, 0-2, 0-3, 1-2. They're gonna want to make some changes. Maybe not right after week 1, but they are going to want to make some changes soon. So Detroit, after they beat Kansas City, they have Seattle next week in week 2 at home. Week 3, Atlanta Falcons at home. Week 4, they travel to Green Bay. Week 5, back home versus Carolina and Bryce Young. And then week 6, they travel to Tampa Bay to face Baker Mayfield, maybe, and the Buccaneers. So, these next 2 weeks, they head home to play Seattle and Atlanta, and I expect the offense to put up points in both games. That's good. Really good insight there, Bandit. Good insight. As we saw on Thursday night, basically, Detroit's offense, it runs through the sun god. It runs through Amon-Ra St. Brown. But keep an eye on Sam Laporta in your fantasy leagues, as his 5 catches on 5 targets for 39 yards may not be all that impressive to some managers, but it's a very encouraging sign for his usage in the Lions' offensive game planning as far as the season early on. Turning our focus to just weeks 4 and 5, though, the Lions return home to Green Bay before, The Lions head to Green Bay before returning home to play Carolina, and I'm a little less enthused by the overall fantasy prospects of the Lions' ancillary fantasy pieces in those games. Essentially, one player to keep an eye on over the next 2 weeks is a player that has been a buzz on social media, beginning on Thursday with all the people who drafted him saying he should get more playing time, and that is Jahmyr Gibbs. Gibbs looked explosive against the Chiefs, but he received only 9 touches to David Montgomery's 21 in a game where the Lions were expected to run a higher volume of offensive plays against Andy Reid, Patrick Mahomes, and the Chiefs. Next week against the Seahawks, I think it's going to be more of the same. And in week 3 against the Falcons, kind of the same deal. I expect the Lions will be able to run a high volume of plays against both teams, as the Seahawks and Falcons are both teams that can have some offensive firepower, and they have improved but still middle of the road defenses. And so David Montgomery will again likely outtouch Jahmyr Gibbs. In weeks 4 and 5, though, against the Packers and Panthers, I do expect the Lions are going to go into those games thinking they may not be able to run as many plays given Green Bay and Carolina's solid defenses and their younger quarterbacks, which may lead to more of a ball control tempo overall, resulting in fewer offensive opportunities for the Lions. Because of this, the Lions may want to give Jahmyr Gibbs more of the running back, more of those high value running back touches against the Packers and Panthers in weeks 4 and 5, whether that be in the red zone, near the goal line, or in 2-minute drills, because he's far more efficient than David Montgomery. He just is, on a per-touch basis. You saw it in week 1, and the Lions may not be afforded as many offensive snaps as they average here in weeks 1 through 3. Against the Chiefs, Gibbs turned his 9 touches into 60 yards, toting the rock 7 times for 42 yards and reeling in 2 receptions for 18 yards, which was good for roughly 6.666 yards per touch. Montgomery, on the other hand, turned his 21 touches against the Chiefs, and they were all rushing attempts. Keep that in mind. He wasn't targeted in the receiving game. So he turned his 21 touches, his 21 carries against the Chiefs into 74 yards, which stats out to a rather pedestrian 3.5 yards per attempt. And he did score a touchdown from a couple yards out when they got into the red zone there. Now here's where I want to take a step back from the stats and just, focus on the game that we are playing, fantasy football, the leagues we are playing in, and the managers that you are playing against. Because after this week, as I mentioned up top, managers will either be 0-1 or 1-0. After next week, some will start 0-2. The week after that, 0-3. And those managers are going to be desperate to shake things up at that point, if not sooner. So I want you to pay close attention to the manager who rosters Jahmyr Gibbs in your leagues, because what type of manager are they? Do they like to make trades? Are they impatient? Are they vocal? If so, you might want to start thinking about making offers for Jahmyr Gibbs as soon as next weekend, especially if, against the Seahawks, he's out-touched by David Montgomery once again and by a decent margin. And maybe even Gibbs sees fewer overall touches than Seahawks backs Kenneth Walker and or Zach Charbonnet, and they have better games than him on the other side of the ball, on the other side of the field. So he, again, looks like he's going to be sort of that 1B or 2 in the Detroit Lions offense versus the top 12 running back he was drafted to be. So I think it makes sense to start making offers for Jahmyr Gibbs before that Seahawks game, and then early on in the week, leading up to the Week 3 game against Atlanta. Because even if those trades are rejected, at least the managers will have hopefully seen them and thought about them at least a little bit, you know? Just get it in their mind a little bit. Just kind of put it in the back of their mind just in case Gibbs doesn't perform up to par. Then, in Week 3, it's Bijan Robinson versus Jahmyr Gibbs. I mean, this is the Dynasty Managers' early matchup of the season. It's the marquee fantasy matchup of the first month of the season as far as these young rookie running backs. And again, there's a very good chance that Montgomery is used more often than Gibbs, as the Lions should be able to move the ball to run a shit ton of plays. And there's also a pretty solid chance that both Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier end the day with more fantasy points than Jahmyr Gibbs. Now, I do want to note before I get too far along in this hypothetical, this, good chance, maybe, all these sort of qualifying words here that don't have a lot of weight to them necessarily. Dan Campbell, head coach of the Lions, did say that Gibbs was going to have his touches managed a little bit prior to the Kansas City Chiefs game. And then after the game, he basically said, he will be more involved from here. Now, that could be coach speak. Sorry about that. I had to take a drink. That could be coach speak, just letting his guys know, letting the media know, letting the fantasy players know, letting the bettors know, all sorts of things. But the fact of the matter is, to borrow a phrase from Matthew Berry, Gibbs was being drafted as a top 12 running back in most fantasy leagues right around the end of round 3, and he was going even higher than that in best ball drafts, and is definitely one of the more valued running backs in all of Dynasty fantasy football at the moment. So he's very, very present in fantasy players' mind. And what I'm focusing on is just redraft in this scenario. And, despite tens of thousands of fantasy voices out there getting off their takes, there's still an edge to be had in fantasy, in redraft, specifically if you're willing to be decisive, particularly early on, particularly when people are starting to get fed up and begin overreacting to, quote, small sample sizes. And I'm saying that because there will be a section of the data-driven fantasy community who will begin most of their Gibbs analysis by saying it's a small sample, but, and so I'm not exactly counting on those guys. I'm not exactly counting on them or their devotees to be all that decisive in moves to acquire Gibbs. There will also be the historical data set devotees that point to Gibbs being a sub 200-pound running back, and how those types of backs have not been all that heavily used in the past, and Gibbs was always destined to be a pass-catching specialist, a third down back that has no prayer of ever gaining the lion's share of the workload, of becoming a true bell cow, so on and so forth, yada, yada, yada. And then there will be the Bandit. That's me. And I'll say, well, duh. The era of the bell cow running back is dead. Efficiency is king at the running back position. And Jahmyr Gibbs looks like he could be one of the most efficient players at the position in our fantasy football game. In our game. I'll say this because I have confidence in Lions offensive coordinator and play caller Ben Johnson, who is going to design his team's game plans based on the teams that the Lions are playing. and he's going to design specific plays for specific players to take advantage in those specific game environments. When you think about the best player callers in the game, the guys who get touted like a Brian Daboll, this is what they do. So, Jahmyr Gibbs may not be all that used in weeks 1, 2, and 3, but I do expect him to tick up into weeks 4 and 5 as we roll the calendar over to October. So, basically, there may be a buy window here for you to go out and trade for Jahmyr Gibbs on the cheap, just in case this happens. Because as things currently stand, I think Jahmyr Gibbs is poised to be the most effective in games with a lower projected Vegas point total. And that's a big part of the process, looking at the point totals that, the bookies are basically setting, because their livelihood depends on it. And I think that basically those lower projected Vegas point totals and fewer projected overall offensive plays, at least here in the early part of the season, as we're sort of figuring out team strengths, weaknesses, who's contenders, who's pretenders, while the lines are actually settling in and their players are getting their legs back under them as they adjust to the NFL game speed, I expect Gibbs to be less used than he will be against these, slower, lower point total games. Because as you may have seen on Thursday night, Lions rookie safety Brian Branch, for instance, went down with a non-contact injury, and it was later revealed he was simply suffering from cramps. That's to be expected. Starters are playing far more snaps than they were all spring and summer, and the rookies are going into a season where they're playing against the toughest competition of their life in longer games and in a longer season. So I expect Gibbs' usage to increase down the stretch as we march towards the fantasy playoffs, but if you're able to capitalize early on in the season, say after week 3, you may be able to get one of the most efficient young players in fantasy at a discount. Say you can trade, and dynasty players, just cover your ears here, okay? Because this is redraft. But say you can trade Alexander Mattison or James Conner straight up for Jahmyr Gibbs after week 3. That's a trade that may be possible. Just depending on how the first few weeks here shake out, and a trade like that, it would have caused an uproar in most redraft leagues if it had happened on Labor Day. But as the players get out there, as league managers start to see their records tick up or tick down, it's something that could be possible, as, a third going on a fourth of the season is going to be passing by, and they're going to want to make a move to start trying to stack wins. And a guy like Alexander Mattison, a guy like James Conner is probably going to be a much, more static, involved piece of that game plan for their teams. And, maybe you could even do a 2-for-2 trade, possibly sending David Montgomery for Jahmyr Gibbs, while also trading, say, Tyler Lockett for JSN. That would be a coup. Dynasty managers would be, slapping you on the back, because those are two of the best young players, 2 first-round 2023 rookies, and they should perform very well down the stretch when you need to count on them for your fantasy playoffs. So who knows? Just keep an eye on that Gibbs manager and their temperament over the next few weeks.